matter is patients identify two main things. First of all, they identify stress, which Justin will speak about shortly. But they also, a huge percentage, identify diet being a trigger. So irrespective of whether as a clinician you would like to ignore diet and only focus on pharmacotherapy, so whether you would like to ignore dietary factors, the truth of the matter is about 40 to 60% of patients have actually tried to modify their diet and have identified dietary triggers before they come to see their clinician. The keys of why diet may actually be effective in the treatment of DGBI conditions like functional dyspepsia and irritable bowel syndrome come from, like for me at least, when I was researching in this area, come from the fact that diet can cause neuromodulation in the gastrointestinal tract. Diet can also cause changes in the GI motility. So an example being peppermint tea could actually relax the stomach. Whiskey causes changes in the fundus, in the fundal accommodation. Obviously, when you eat a diet, it varies very much in terms of the fiber content. And so in that way, diet can actually influence laxation. And as I spoke about peppermint before, it does actually cause smooth muscle relaxation, which is an antispasmodic effect. So I think that we are using quite a lot of medications, right? That if you actually were to modify your diet, could actually replace some of the pharmacotherapy. There's lots of diets that have actually been suggested to be able to address the symptoms of functional dyspepsia and irritable bowel syndrome. And some of the diets that have been suggested include the low FODMAP diet, a traditional diet. So a traditional diet is when a dietitian or a clinician actually advises you to eat 3 standard meals, don't overeat, reduction of caffeine, alcohol, oily diet, etc. A gluten-free diet, a low lactose diet, Mediterranean diet, and the Tritonium-based diet, which is a special type of grain that they used to replace wheat. So the two diets that I'll mainly be talking about today are the low FODMAP diet and the low lactose diet. I'm sorry about the next slide. So the next slide, because I actually don't have any Vietnamese data, but initially when I was researching in the low FODMAP diet and looking at diets for the management of DGBI in Hong Kong, many people told me that diet would not be helpful because Chinese people eat rice, and rice does not have a lot of FODMAPs, and actually the Thai have actually done quite a lot of studies to show that rice is actually very well absorbed, generates very, very little gas, so is unlikely to be very irritating to the gastrointestinal tract. But actually, if you look at the traditional Chinese diet, it is loaded with more, recently lactose, but also the traditional diet contains a lot of garlic, onions, beans, and wheat and soy sauce, which are actually significant components of the low FODMAP diet. I'm going to skip past this slide. In terms of functional dyspepsia, the low FODMAP diet, which I'll take you through fairly shortly, addresses a couple of issues. We know that a diet that is high in FODMAPs actually triggers a lot of transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxation. And so as a consequence of that, you will actually be more likely to belch. You will be more likely to experience some reflux symptoms. The high FODMAP diet, so a diet that is high in FODMAPs also impairs the gastric accommodation, and also a bulky diet, so a diet that is actually very, very high in like fresh fruit and vegetables actually can cause distension, so stretching, which triggers the visceral hypersensitivity in patients with irritable bowel syndrome. What we find is that a diet that is high in FODMAPs causes osmotic actions in the gastrointestinal tract, and in functional dyspepsia appears to cause the duodenal immune system to be activated. When I spoke about visceral hypersensitivity, you'll see that when we study these patients, right, patients can actually be, healthy controls, in which case they eat the diets that we give them, and they actually don't experience a lot of symptoms. But in patients who have DGPIs, what you find is this graph on the left, this is a normal patient. So after they eat, they may experience a little bit of fullness in their tummy, right? That's very normal. But in a patient with functional dyspepsia, and this is irritable bowel syndrome data, after these patients eat, they experience a huge range of symptoms. They may experience nausea, they may experience discomfort, they may experience bloating, they may experience pain, they may experience fullness. So what's the evidence to date for the study of the low FODMAP diet in either functional dyspepsia or irritable bowel syndrome? I have to say, the data, as Linda just spoke about, is largely Western data. So we don't have a lot of Asian data, but I will present some Asian data today. For functional dyspepsia, there are only 3 studies. And if you look at the studies, right, they're actually, so the first 2 studies are what we call taught studies. So it's like somebody, a dietitian or a nurse, teaching the patients. The last study is a fed study. But you can see that once you start feeding patients and providing all their food, right, the numbers of the study participants go down, because it's very, very difficult for us to conduct dietary studies. If you can imagine any one of you, if you were to participate in a dietary study, you'd probably prefer somebody to teach you how to avoid foods versus me replacing all your foods and telling you that the only thing that you can drink from your home is water, right? And then you'll have to eat everything else that's supplied by the university. It's very challenging. So for functional dyspepsia, only 3 studies. For okay, there's actually quite a few missing slides. Okay, that's okay. There was another 3 slides after this, and the 3 slides were basically talking about for irritable bowel syndrome, for the low FODMAP diet. There's 26 studies to date. They are a mixture of taught dietary studies, and they are also a mixture of fed studies, where all your food and all your drink is replaced by the researchers. And what those studies have found, what those 26 studies have found, are that in patients following a low FODMAP diet who have irritable bowel syndrome, around 60 to up to 80% of patients actually experience significant relief of their symptoms. So what symptoms are improved by the low FODMAP diet? Largely, epigastric pain and abdominal pain would be improved by the low FODMAP diet. Gas-related symptoms, so belching, so burping a lot, can be improved. Significantly, bloating and distension are improved by the low FODMAP diet. Early satiety and postprandial bloating, so some people feel excessively full after their meal. That is actually improved by the low FODMAP diet. And also too much gas down the bottom, so too much flatulence is improved. The stool form can also be improved by the low FODMAP diet. So patients who have diarrhea or who have constipation, the low FODMAP diet seems to address that, but not as much, in my opinion, as the gas-related symptoms. So the bloating, the belching, the fettus seems to improve, and the pain and discomfort seems to improve the most. Missing slides. Okay, so the next few slides takes you through the study that we performed at Hong Kong University. It was basically a fed study. So we had 59 patients who were enrolled in our study. They either had functional dyspepsia, irritable bowel syndrome, or functional dyspepsia overlapping with irritable bowel syndrome, and we had 6 healthy controls. In each group, there were approximately 20 patients. So in this group, this is our study that is unpublished, we had 20 patients with functional dyspepsia. And how we performed this study is, in the first instance, they gave us a diary in terms of what foods they were eating, number 1. Then after that, they were randomized either to a typical Hong Kong diet, where the FODMAP content is about 15 to 20 grams, okay? Or else the patient would be randomized to a low FODMAP diet. A low FODMAP diet is around 3 grams of FODMAPs. What we found in this study on patients with functional dyspepsia is that postprandial fullness, so that feeling of excessive fullness, significantly improved on the low FODMAP diet. We also found that they belched less, and their scoring symptoms in terms of pain and discomfort improved significantly on the low FODMAP diet. But these are symptom-based. So more powerful than symptom-based is we actually had the patients do their breath testing, right, to see how much hydrogen and methane they were generating when they were eating our diet. And what you can see is that a typical Hong Kong diet versus a low FODMAP diet, the amount of gas that patients generate is halved. So there's less gas, 50% less gas. So the observations were that the area under the curve of hydrogen production was significantly reduced on the low FODMAP diet. And the low FODMAP diet resulted in reduced pain, bloating, flatulence, belching, and significant improvements in the gastrointestinal score in functional dyspepsia. 70 to 80% of patients experience I don't know why these slides are blank. Very strange. A graph showing the results of approximately 20 patients who had irritable bowel syndrome, who were actually fed a low FODMAP diet or a typical Hong Kong diet. And what we also found in this case was that basically the low FODMAP diet reduced pain, bloating, flatulence, belching, and the gastrointestinal score in irritable bowel syndrome. And the improvement is actually significant. Around 70 to 80% of patients experience improvement of a VAS score, a scoring system of 10 millimeters, and significantly 60% of patients improve their VAS by 20 millimeters, which is actually a fairly significant improvement. And we actually surveyed the patients to ask them whether eating a low FODMAP diet was acceptable to them, whether it was tasty enough, and they said yes. But the problem with the low FODMAP diet is that it's actually really troublesome, right? It's really, really restrictive. So the elimination phase, the patient, there's loads of vegetables, there's loads of beans, legumes, there's loads of fruits that the patients cannot have, and also dairy products. And then, so that's phase one. The second phase is the reintroduction phase. So the patients have to have some foods reintroduced to test if that they can tolerate that food in small amounts. And then the integration phase is when the patient comes up with a repertoire of foods that they can eat, including some moderate to high FODMAP foods. This type of elimination phase, reintroduction phase, and integration phase usually is done with the help of either trained nurse practitioners or dietitians. I think that what we can see is that the low FODMAP diet, there's a lot of evidence for it. Not as much evidence for functional dyspepsia, but quite a lot of evidence for irritable bowel syndrome, but it is really, really quite complicated. And if you don't want to trigger an eating disorder in some patients, then you might consider another diet. So the diet that we've had quite a lot of success with our patients is the low lactose diet. And what does this speak to? Lactose is a part of the low FODMAP diet. In general, the low lactose diet is excluded in Western populations because their rates of lactose intolerance and malabsorption are around 20%. Okay? Whereas in Asia, by the time people are over the age of 7, about 85% of people here actually lose their brush border lactose and actually can't metabolize lactose. So if you were to adopt a low lactose diet, what would you be looking at? Basically, it's easy to say stop drinking milk, but then you have to think about yogurt, you have to think about ice cream, you have to think about cream. We also, and I think that the diet itself is actually fairly easily achievable, right? With a simple dietitian educating the patient. And in general, for patients who actually have mild to moderate symptoms, it's probably first line treatment in dietary treatment in this population. If you think about how lactose can actually trigger symptoms, usually if you have lactase persistence, so you actually have the enzyme that can break down lactose into glucose and galactose, you will actually have no problems, right? If you don't have the enzyme, the lactose just travels along until it encounters the distal small intestine as well as the large intestine, and then the bacteria start to ferment the lactose. It generates a lot of short-chain fatty acids, a lot of gas, carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen, which actually causes the distension and the pain. Usually with the low lactose diet, because traditionally people in this area are actually eating, like even in Hong Kong, in China, they could actually eat an extremely low lactose diet themselves. So we don't have to go through this very complicated elimination phase, reintroduction phase, and integration phase. So the teaching of the low lactose diet is actually much more simple. And if you want to test, so two ways of dispensing the low lactose diet. Patients can have a trial with the low lactose diet, but if they would like to, do further investigation, we can actually perform hydrogen breath tests or gene tests for lactase. It's a simpler diet, and however, we only know of one study where they reviewed the low lactose diet versus the low FODMAP diet in a Swiss population where traditionally lactose malabsorption is only of the order of 20%. And what they found was that the low FODMAP diet was superior to the low lactose diet. But I think that was the wrong audience to, study that in. I have one more slide, and all it says is basically for patients in this population who have mild symptoms, try the low lactose diet first. For patients with moderate symptoms, then you would probably think about the low FODMAP diet. And for patients with severe symptoms, they would probably think about diet as well as pharmacotherapy. Thank you.
Vâng.